Alright, we're going to start with the bananas since I assume that's the part of this design people are most curious about. So we have our little banana ring, and first and foremost we are going to flip it over and we're going to cut the little tie out here, and when the machine ties in it usually pulls the thread to the underside of the design, which leaves those threads free to get caught up in the bananas. So there's a good chance that your bananas will have at least one little thread connecting some of them that you will have to trim away before you can position them. And then unfortunately there's nothing I can really do about that. That's just how the machine itself functions. After our tie-ins and tie-outs are trimmed, I'm just going to take each of these and twist them up. And I'm going to want the bobbin side underneath. This is the bobbin side. I'm going to want that facing down because I find that it's just a little bit easier to turn the bananas up this way. So I'm just going to take each one of these and I'm going to turn it up and work my way around. I'm going to reposition my hand a little bit here and just position them and tuck them into place. And now I'm holding this little orb of bananas. Now when I put this down, it's not going to stay exactly in this position. It's going to kind of try and return to its original position, but this is okay. You're most probably not going to be able to get the bananas to stick perfectly straight up, but this is more than good enough. And once we actually assemble them, I'll explain why this is more than good enough. Alright, and here we have our little banana stalk or stem or whatever you want to call this. Other than just trim the tie-ins and tie-outs on the back of this, you do not need to do anything to this. You can just set it down and let it dry. It does not have to be perfectly straight. Once the bananas are placed on it, the weight of them is just going to cause it to fall over in the proper position anyway. Alright, now that our bananas are all posed and dried, we can assemble them. So we're just going to slip the first one onto the banana stalk. Then the second one. And I'm going to use a tweezers to slide the bananas between one another all the way around. Alright, and we're just going to continue onward like that. The third one specifically is going to be just a little bit harder, but still not too difficult. And there is no set number of bananas that necessarily go onto this, so however many you think looks right is perfectly fine. For this video though, I'm going to go ahead and put on all 6 of the bananas. And this is also why I said that each little banana ring doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, because once you slide the bananas between one another, that's going to do a lot to hold them straight. The bananas themselves are going to hold each other much more straight. Right, and that is our little stalk of bananas. Alright, next we have our leaf. So we're just going to trim the tie-ins and tie-outs underneath this leaf. And after we do that, there's 2 things we can do with this. If you want it to just be perfectly straight, you can just place it upside down and let it dry like that. If you want it to look more natural, I'm going to take this and I'm going to bend the leaf into a position that looks more like how an actual banana leaf would look. So I have tried using different things to clamp this leaf in this position, and found that almost anything will make noticeable indentions in the leaf. So unless you have something that is completely flat and can clamp this evenly from both sides, I would say that you're better off just bending it with your hands and then placing it just like that and letting it dry just like that. And now we have our dead leaf. So first things first, you can trim the tie out on the back of this, but it does kind of blend in much better with this one, so you might opt just not to care about that. Secondly, this is a bit more delicate than the other pieces, and occasionally you may notice that some of these loops have sort of come out of place and are sticking much further out than the others. If that is the case, you can safely cut any loops that are sticking out disproportionately, and that it won't ruin the leaf. So for this, we're going to want to bend the stem over like this and find something to hold it in place with. This is going to make assembling it much easier and keep the leaf in the position it belongs in on the completed tree. So anything you could use to keep this in this position will work, but for this video, I'm going to use something that I know everyone making this design has, which is a bobbin. I'm just going to slip it over like that, place it down, and let my leaf dry just like that. Alright, now we have the banana trunk. So after you have washed this out and trimmed any tie-ins and tie-outs on the back, you can place it upside down and simply let it dry just like that. Now you can position this and hand stitch it together while it is wet, but unlike the other pieces, you don't necessarily have to position this while it's wet. You can let it dry. It might be a little easier to hand stitch while it is still wet, but if you're too rough with it, you might also pull it out of shape a little bit. So if you would prefer not to take that risk, just position it upside down, because if you position it right side up, it might try and bow up like this a little bit, which is the exact opposite of what we want it to do. So I'm going to go ahead and position it upside down, press it down to make sure it stays flat, and I'm just going to leave it like that until it is dry, at which point I will stitch it together. Alright, now that our banana trunk is dry, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it together. So first, I'm going to pinch the end here and get a few passes of thread to hold that together. Right, so once I've got that together, I'm going to want to position this in a cylindrical type position. Now you can just do this by hand, or you can use a little helper tool to get it in position, something to press against like this. If you don't have this exact tool, I'd assume the handle of something like a fork or a spoon would work as well. So one thing I want to pay close attention to is the edges here tend to shift up and down and not stay in position, and I want them to meet up perfectly on both sides so that the trunk is actually balanced and can stand after it is stitched together. So with my little helper tool, I'm just going to continue stitching my way up the trunk, paying close attention for at least a little while. Make sure that my edges stay in position, and if one shifts further up or further down, I'm going to move them back while I still have an opportunity to do that, because once I get too many stitches in place, it's going to be immovable. And if you find any spots that are just a bit too hard and you can't get the needle through, just poke around until you find an easier spot. Make sure that my edges, yep, they're still in place. Haven't encountered any hard spots yet. but inevitably, at least a few times, I will find a spot that's just too hard for me to get the needle through, and I'll have to poke around and find a little bit better of a spot. All right, and once I reach here, where the direction of the edge of this changes, I'm going to stop stitching there. I'm not going to stitch it all the way up to the ends here. I'm going to stop right here. Now, you don't necessarily have to, but I do find that this retains its cylindrical position a little bit better if you put a second layer of stitches all the way back down. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to get a few stitches down, give myself a little bit of room. And the same thing I did on the way up, I'm going to use my thumb to press down on this here so that I'm keeping it in that perfectly cylindrical position. Since we don't want it to bow up like this, we want it to stay pressed down like this so that it looks like a tree trunk is supposed to look. I go ahead and clip off these little threads right now so they don't get caught in what I'm doing, because we don't want little loops. We don't want little loops sticking off the trunk for no reason. Cut that and try and get this to take on as much of a natural tree trunk shape as I can. I'm going to bend these little things outward just like that, and it should stand. Alright, now that all our pieces are washed out, dried, and put together, we can assemble the tree. So first, we're going to start with the trunk and the dried leaves. Now, we could just hook these on there and leave them like that, or you can glue them in there. I'm going to go ahead and do this because I think it'll be just a little bit easier to put the tree together if they are secured in place. So I'm going to put that in there, and I'm going to grab a tweezers and press it into place. And I'm going to go ahead and move around and do that. I'm going to put all 3 dead leaves in this tree. You don't necessarily have to. You can put 1, 2, 3, or none at all. But we have space for 3, so we're going to go ahead and put all 3 here for this video. And then we're going to move on to our leaves. So all I'm going to do here is put a little drop of hot glue along the stem, and I'm going to put this leaf in place, And do the same thing with the tweezers. Now you don't necessarily even need to use the tweezers here. You can just hold this leaf in place for a bit until it dries like that. And that'll also work. I do prefer using the tweezers though to try and get it in the right position, because they might try and move out of the position I want them in unless I press them in place. And all I'm going to do is continue putting leaves around in a circle like that until I have put as many leaves as I can fit, while leaving just a little bit of place for the bananas. There is no set number of leaves you need to use for this design though. So however many leaves you think looks right is just fine. And of course the bananas themselves are also optional if you want a tree that doesn't have any on it. I'm going to go ahead and bend these down a little bit to get them out of my way so that I can continue putting my leaves in place. Alright, now that all of our leaves are in place, I'm just going to pose them. I'm going to bend some of them down further than others. Some of them I'm going to leave sticking almost straight up. And we've left just a little bit of room in the center of the tree to place our bananas. And we have a good bit of leeway on the banana stalk, so we can actually just slide this in between all these leaves here, and we don't even really need to glue this stalk at all. It will just stay there. And like that, it's quite adjustable. If you don't like how many bananas are on the stalk, you could take it off and add some or remove some. So I would say don't glue the bananas at all. They should just stay here on their own. And let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and shuffle them around until I find where they're balanced. If you get the leaves in a good position, it will just stay standing up on its own. If you have something you want to place the tree on or in, like a little flower pot or some kind of stand or some decoration, just take your hot glue, put a bit of hot glue inside the bottom of the trunk, and then just stick it on something, and it should stay there. Alright, next is the leaf for the more complex banana tree. If you're only making the simple version, you do not need this leaf at all, but you'll need 4 more if you're making the more complex banana tree. So you can do the exact same thing. You can just sit it and let it dry, or you can bend it the exact same way. and it might just be a little bit easier to assemble if you take this and bend that upwards just a little bit like that. After which, I'm going to do the same thing. Just going to flip it over. I'm going to let it dry like that. Alright, now that we've assembled our simple banana tree, we're going to move on to the more complicated version. And a bit of warning, this is more like an extra design. My original design was the simpler one. This one was simply an attempt to make it look as realistic as I could, but it is admittedly harder to put together than the simple version. So to start with, I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing I did before. I'm only going to put 2 dead leaves on this time just because 2 is what I have on hand, and I think it actually looks a little bit better with 1 or 2 than 3 anyway. Alright, so now we're going to assemble our leaves. So this is going to be a little bit more difficult because we're going to have to assemble the leaves before we put them in the trunk. So, and we need them to all bow out in different directions. So I find it impossibly difficult to manage to hold all 5 of the leaves I'm going to use here in my hand at once. So I'm going to make this easy on myself and use 2 at a time, making sure they are going to fall out in opposite directions. And I'm just going to put a little drop of hot glue right at the end here, not too much, but just enough to hold them together. And I'm going to let that dry. Then I'm going to do it with 2 more of these leaves. Okay, I think our leaves are dry enough. So now I'm going to take both of these. I'm going to take one of these and slip it between the other one here, as far as I can go. I think that's about right there. All right, I'm going to hold this like this because remember, I want all of these leaves to bow out in different directions. So I'm trying to make sure they all actually do that, because otherwise you're going to have a bunch of leaves all falling to one side on your tree, and it's not going to look very good. So I'm going to glue these 4 leaves together now. And this is admittedly a bit tedious. If you can manage to hold all 5 leaves in your hand, all going in different directions, then consider me impressed. But if you can, that would certainly be a lot easier than what I'm doing. But this is the best I can manage, is to hold 2 at a time. Maybe I could get 3, but I don't think it would really be much faster than just doing 2 at a time. And my last leaf, I'm just gonna put somewhere. See where would be the best place for you to look. This looks like a little crevice it could fit in right here. And I'm just going to orientate this one to where it's hopefully not bowing out in the same direction as any of the other 4, or not the exact same direction at least. I'm going to glue this guy on here. There we go. All right. Just gonna put my little leaf cluster aside. And now I'm gonna take one of these leaves with the wide base. I'm gonna take my bananas, which are green this time for some variation, and we're going to attach the bananas to this leaf. So you will notice we have a lot of extra slack on these bananas, and that's because we are using the same file as we did with the other banana tree where we needed lots of slack to push down into the trunk. And the reason I decided to leave so much slack on this one is because since there's not a set number of bananas you are necessarily meant to use for this, and there's two different trunk lengths, I can't really account for every possible variation. So I decided to leave as much slack as possible on this one too, just so that people have as much variation with as little confusion as possible. But generally, what I find works best is that if the edge of your bananas right here falls somewhere in between this point on the leaf where it transitions from being wide to just a single satin column stem, and about the center of about the center here between where the leaf starts and where the wide stem starts. So somewhere between here and here is about where I want the edge of my bananas to fall. So I'm going to go ahead and put just a little bit of glue in the base of that leaf, and I'm going to get my bananas sitting somewhere in that range and just press the stem into that glue right there. So that looks like it dried really quickly this time. So next I'm gonna take my leaves here and let me look for which side is flattest, and position that how I want it. I'm gonna take this and put a little bit more glue along the wider part of this. I'm gonna take my leaves, I'm going to position them inside here, and I'm going to wrap this wide part around my leaves and hold it like that for a few seconds until it is dry. Now I'm going to take another one of my leaves like this. I'm going to put some glue along the inside there. And I'm going to wrap it on the opposite side right here. And just push it around and wrap it tight. And you're probably going to want to be a bit forceful with this one and wrap it really tight to make sure that our base here stays thin enough to where it can still fit in the trunk after we're done with this. And you can see that the first leaf is wrapped here, and then the second one I positioned just a little bit further down because I want these leaves to slowly work their way down to make sure the base here doesn't get too big around to fit in the trunk. So these guys dry pretty fast. So I'm going to take my third leaf, and when I put this one on, I'm not just going to put it right on the opposite side. You could if you wanted to, but I'm going to place it like right here instead so that they look like they kind of go around naturally rather than just left, right, left, right. So same thing. Get a little bit of glue in there and place it somewhere like right here, somewhere around there. Doesn't necessarily matter exactly where. Just not quite perfectly in line with the others. And that's going to dry pretty fast. And I'm going to take this one and again place it just a little bit further down, and I'll place it somewhere like right here. And again, I'm going to push this really tight on here to try and keep the base as narrow as possible. All right, and this is another reason the banana stalk is better if it's a little bit longer, because there's not necessarily a set number of these wide base leaves you need to put on here either. So if you want more than 4, if you want 6, 8, whatever, them having something that runs down the center of them all is going to help keep them together. So let's see, I think I'll make the front of the tree here. It looks like the bananas are falling out of this side, so I'll make this the front. And what I'm going to do last is put a little bit of glue around the base here, so that when I place this in the trunk, it actually has something to hold it there. I'm just going to stuff this in kind of tight in the trunk to make sure that it looks okay and it stays. And once all is said and done, then I can just position the leaves, bend the lower leaves down, and I'll leave the ones closer to the center sticking up a little bit. Looks like some of my leaves have gotten turned around here. I think this is how they, yeah, this one goes here. Looks like this one got a little bit twisted up. And I can just orientate my leaves as needed till I find the balance point. And again, if you want this to sit on something more permanent, just put a little bit of glue alongside the underneath of the trunk inside around the ring and stick it to whatever you want it to stay on permanently. All right, so I'm just gonna take some hot glue and try and get it in the base of the tree here, enough to where it will glue to the pot. And let's just hold our tree here for a minute. Get rid of these little excess glue trails. And there we go. Let me support it because I don't think it's quite dry yet, but there we go. Our banana tree is now firmly in a little pot, or whatever else you can find that you want it to stay in. Nope, the glue's still not dry. Gotta hold that there for a minute.